Good morning. The sitting is open. Now, the first item of business this morning is the debate on the report titled Child Abuse in Institutions in Europe, document 15889, presented by Mr. Pierre-Alain Frides on behalf of the Committee on Social Affairs, Health and Sustainable Development, with an opinion from the Committee Legal Affairs and Human Rights presented by Mr. Konstantinos Efstatiu. In order to finish around 11:55 a.m., I will interrupt the list of speakers at about 11:45 a.m. to allow time for the reply and the vote. Now I call Mr. Frides, rapporteur. You have 7 minutes to present the report, and then we'll have a further 3 minutes to reply to the debate at the end.
Merci, monsieur.
Thank you very much indeed, President. Ladies and gentlemen, in countless European countries, there have been cases of very serious child abuse in the past, in public and in religious institutions. And for several decades now, there's been one revelation after another, just about everywhere in Europe. Physical violence, psychological violence, sexual abuse, deprivation of care, forced adoptions, forced sterilizations. The list of forms of abuse is endless. My work on this deeply disturbing subject began in October 2022 with a hearing before the Social Affairs Committee. It was a very powerful moment with testimonies that moved many of us to tears. That of a young Romanian woman who had survived the death orphanages of the Ceausescu era, a veritable system for eliminating troublesome children. It is estimated that 500,000 children, most of them dead, were involved in this. Children, some of them suffering from disabilities, some of them mild disabilities, were literally abandoned by the Romanian state, condemned to a life of deprivation, hunger, cold, or even violence. And what about the testimony of the German man in his 70s, who was an innocent child victim abused by priests in a religious institution to which he had been entrusted? Romania, Germany, but in fact most European countries are concerned. And the point here is not to stigmatize one country in particular or to drop a ranking of horror. What has happened in many countries is beyond comprehension. Orphanages of death in Ireland and Romania, appalling stories in Scandinavian countries, children placed, maltreated, exploited on Swiss and French farms, Catholic clerics committing sexual abuse in Germany, Belgium, Spain, France and Switzerland. Child abuse is unfortunately a universal reality. And before talking about other people, we need to put our own house in order. My country, Switzerland, is currently living through the revelations of multiple abuses perpetrated over the last few decades by priests on children or young people entrusted to their care, particularly in religious schools. More than 1,000 cases have come to light to date, dating from the 1970s to the present day. Undoubtedly, the tip of the iceberg. A country in shock, a country with distraught parishioners leaving the church in their hundreds. But the aim of this report is not simply to take stock, to record the facts, to recall all the terrible things that have happened to hundreds of thousands of children and teenagers in our various countries over the past few decades. The aim of this report is above all to contribute to the prevention and, if possible, the reparation of what can still be done. This approach is based on the example of my country, Switzerland, a country that has been able to confront its past. It's been forced to do so by the mobilization and testimonies of its victims, children placed in religious institutions or by administrative decisions of the civil authorities in institutions, or, for example, farms, children who are therefore victims of both exploitation and abuse. Under the impetus of Mr. Guido Fleury's foundation, this protest movement put forward the People's Initiative on Reparation and the Justice Initiative, and succeeded in developing a strong mobilization in Switzerland, creating the political conditions which forced the Swiss Federal Council, our government, to express to the survivors who were victims of these abuses the Swiss government's official apology for past actions, and set up a program of reparation and compensation to be paid by the state. Around 12,000 survivors of abuse have benefited from these measures. Across Europe, groups of victims of abuse are seeking redress in their respective countries, similar to that decided and implemented in Switzerland. They have come together under the umbrella of the Swiss Justice Initiative and the Fleury Foundation. 2 years ago, I was contacted by Mr. Fleury and his team. They suggested that I submit a proposal for a report to our Assembly with a view to extending to the whole of our continent the exemplary strategy adopted and put forward by the Swiss authorities, a strategy that I shall endeavour to describe to you now. First of all, to establish an inventory of what happened in the country, a process of remembrance that is often difficult because the law of silence reigns most often. It will be necessary to create the conditions that will allow people to speak out in all our countries, to analyse and understand the mechanisms that allow these unacceptable, unspeakable acts to occur, to prosecute and punish the perpetrators of the abuse if they are identified and if they're still alive, and ideally to ensure that there is no statute of limitations applied. Above all, to recognise the suffering endured and experienced by the victims, to offer them help and assistance, and to pay for any possible treatment, particularly psychological, if the people suffering so wish. Make an official apology. The state and the authorities must acknowledge that they have failed in their duty of care towards the victims. Provide substantial financial compensation to victims. Create the conditions for never again, through information, education, prevention, monitoring the institutions and strengthening the legal foundations. And create places of remembrance so that these horrors will never be forgotten. My wish, and above all the wish of the members of the Justice Initiative, is that all European countries should do their duty to remember, carry out historical work, call for testimonies with all the humanity and respect for people that these different approaches require. And then, depending on the specific situation and characteristics in each of our countries, the authorities should take charge of the reparation process and make it a priority, a national effort to remember. Bringing to light the suffering of the past, the wounds that are concealed, buried and repressed in the deepest corners of people who've been forever scarred, can be a source of fear, anxiety and often cause feelings of shame, even though these people have nothing to be ashamed of. But in the end, the proposed approach should bring relief, calm, and a form of release to victims who are still trapped in intolerable silence. In any case, this is the example to which Switzerland can bear witness. To conclude, I would like to share a news item from a few weeks ago. According to a Romanian source, there is a discussion in Romania of granting survivors who lived in the notorious orphanages between 1947 and 1997 a monthly pension and a monthly allowance for care, such as psychotherapy sessions, as well as granting exemption from certain taxes. I will not venture to suggest that there is a connection between this decision that's been taken and my evaluation visit carried out in Romania last September. I'd like to thank I'd like to call you to support the text. I'd like to end by thanking Mr. Guillaume Perron, who helped me in the drafting of this report. And I'd also like to pay tribute to Mr. Guido Fleury and his team for the Justice Initiative. And they're with us here today in the Spectators Gallery. And among them, there are people who've been concerned by these acts. I'd like to pay tribute to them. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Mr. Frides. Now I call Mr. Evstatiou for the opinion from the Committee on Legal Affairs and Human Rights.
Thank you, my compatriot President. I would like first to start by congratulating Mr. Frides for his excellent report. This report raises awareness about the many forms of abuse perpetrated in public and private institutions against children in Europe for decades. It reaffirms Council of Europe's member states' commitment to combat violence against children in Europe and intends to open a debate on how to acknowledge the true dimension of the problem and the need to provide redress to all the victims and to prosecute the perpetrators. It also makes a thorough analysis of child abuse situations in Europe, such as acts of physical and sexual violence, child removals, forced institutionalization, and forced adoptions. Relying on several NGOs and other sources, it presents an appalling truth about church and state-run institutions, foster homes, hospital homes, mistreatment of children, and its lifelong consequences to their health and well-being. It becomes clear from the reading of this report how these events were kept uncovered for too long and how most of the countries where such abuses have occurred have not yet implemented sufficient and/or adequate measures to provide redress to the victims. From the analysis of several countries' cases and responses, France's, Germany's, and Romania's, it was possible to conclude that this is a pan-European problem that should be looked at and treated with the maximum concern from state authorities and good practices, such as the Swiss example. This report, as well as this draft resolution and draft recommendations, deals with the main hurdles these victims face when trying to obtain justice, the usual lack of proof and the statutory limitations in legal proceedings, and flags out the persistence in many European states of a lack of suitable legal frameworks and of reparation funds to victims. Children are the most vulnerable group of society. Due to their vulnerability and their inherent weakness, we have a duty and a special responsibility towards them, and therefore must adopt protective measures drawn specifically for their protection. According to the well-established case law of the European Court of Human Rights, Member States have a duty to protect children from violence and to provide redress to the victims of abuse under Article 3, prohibition of torture and ill treatment, Article 8, right to respect for private life, and 13, right to effective remedy of the Convention. For instance, in its landmark cases of child abuse of orphanages, X and others versus Bulgaria, and in primary schools managed in Catholic Church, O'Keefe versus Ireland, the court held that the state's positive obligations to protect individuals from ill treatment must be fulfilled through the establishment of an adequate legislative framework with effective criminal law provisions. Alongside a robust and suitable legislative framework, it is crucial to the protection of children and institutions that these special safeguards exist and properly function. As established by the Court, special safeguards such as the detection and reporting mechanism must not only be put in place, but they also have to be sufficiently effective in order to ensure that when abuse occurs, it can be reported by the victims, the allegations duly investigated, and the remedies provided. The report refers to Council of Europe standards, such as the Lanzarote Convention on the Protection of Children Against Sexual Exploitation and Sexual Abuse, and the European Social Charter. Member States' obligations in this area also arise under the most important human rights treaty of our organization, the European Convention on Human Rights. The report is entirely in line with the obligations flowing from the European Convention on Human Rights and other international legal standards, and is an important contribution to the Assembly's work on the protection of children. The Committee of Legal Affairs and Human Rights unanimously supported Mr. Fritez's report and asked the Assembly to do the same. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Efstatu. In the debate, I call first Ms. Lesia Vasilenko from Ukraine for ALDE.
Thank you, President. Dear colleagues, on behalf of the ALDE Group, I'd like to thank the rapporteur for tackling such an important subject in the realm of children's rights. This report, in fact, is very much linked with the report on deported Ukrainian children. As so many of you heard yesterday during the urgent debate, the children stolen from their families in Ukraine go through a whole chain of abusive institutions in Russia. First, there are the filtration camps, where the children are coerced and manipulated to give false evidence against their parents and consent under pressure to be taken away. Then there are the orphanages themselves. In the report, paragraph 53 accounts the sheer horror of Soviet childcare institutions, where children were labeled into categories, deprived of food, affection, and drugged into submission. This was the norm then in Eastern Bloc countries, Romania, Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, and many more. Since the collapse of the USSR, all these countries are long on the way to deinstitutionalization, all but one. We can all guess which one that is. In Russia, childcare institutions still remain with all the cruelty and mistreatment. From the children rescued from deportation, we know that refusing to deny the facts of the existence of their parents, the continued wish to return to Ukraine to speak the Ukrainian language is considered a mental disability and is treated as such. Children with PTSD who have had to hide in bomb shelters in Mariupol for days and sometimes weeks, or who have seen the bloodsheds of war, are registered as invalids and given no care at all. The saddest part is that little can be done. Russia defies change and sees deinstitutionalization as an evil outburst of Western capitalist imperialism. International rights protection organizations have long been dubbed foreign agents by Moscow and not allowed in the country for monitoring purposes. And Russia aside, we need to look at the global statistics. According to the World Health Organization, almost 1 billion children between the age of 2 and 17 experienced physical, sexual, or emotional violence or neglect in the past year alone. Over 100 million of such children suffer in European institutions. War exacerbates the situation. This assembly must be made aware that the influx of displaced persons from Ukraine over the last 2 years has created extra opportunities for human traffickers. Corrupt individuals find ways to infiltrate social care systems and use orphanages as marketplaces for children. The scheme is too easy. When you have a mother stretched beyond the limit by having escaped bombings that finds herself alone in a foreign country where she doesn't speak the language, with limited resources, no support networks, and no knowledge of local laws, finding pretexts for guardianship authorities to take children from such mothers is not complicated and requires just overly eager whistleblowers. Once the kids are placed in institutions, the criminal schemes kick in. Colleagues, please be vigilant to situations like these in your countries. Upon hearing our rapporteur, we owe a higher level of responsibility to our children and our youth. There are simple steps that each one of us can take when we come back home. And we can make this resolution that we are about to adopt really work. Finally, the ALDE group is in full support of the report and the recommendations, of course, too. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Vasilenko. Now I call Monsieur Emmanuel Fernandez for the United Left UAL group from France. Monsieur Fernandez, the floor is yours. You have 3 minutes.
Oui, merci.
Thank you very much indeed, President. This report addresses a subject that makes for extremely difficult reading and is something that's difficult to conceive of. And in this respect, it echoes the work that we've done in this very assembly yesterday morning in the urgent debate on Ukrainian children in the context of Russia's war of aggression. I'd like to thank the rapporteur, Mr. Frides, for this very detailed and comprehensive work, which is ever so important because it's helping to open up our eyes even more to the despicable and unbearable acts of which our societies in the member states and in Europe have been and still are capable. Yes, in times of war, we, of course, condemn in the strongest terms and we call for an immediate ceasefire in all war zones. As in times of peace, children are maltreated, children are forcibly displaced, children are sexually abused. The aim of this report is clearly stated by the rapporteur, and we also hope that this aim will be achieved, that is to raise collective awareness throughout Europe and the member states, to free people to speak out, to enable survivors to rebuild their lives and receive compensation, and to put in place tools to ensure that such situations can never happen again. Yes, in Europe, 18 million children are victims of sexual abuse, 44 million of physical violence, and 5 to 55 million are victims of psychological violence. These appalling figures need to be heard outside these walls. The child abuse referred to in Mr. Friedes's report was committed by state institutions. There is the example of France, where from the 1960s right up to the early 1980s, more than 2,000 children were moved from the French department of the Reunion Island to France, in particular to the department of Creuse. There is still a huge amount of work to be done in the archives in order to fully understand the institutional mechanisms that made this possible and associations are calling for total transparency in order to bring the families concerned close to the much-needed reconstruction. The report also points to progress that's been made in the recognition of crimes against children committed by both the Catholic and Protestant churches in France and Germany, but it also highlights the immense amount of work that remains to be done. In this list of appalling acts, the report deals with the orphanages in Romania, an absolutely appalling policy of child selection initiated by Nicolae Ceausescu, which resulted in tens of thousands of victims of abuse, many to the point of death. Here, too, the work of transparency and recognition that's been done is huge. Now, as has been said, all Europe is concerned by this, and this report calls on us to face up to the recent past, which is still alive and ever present, so that we can contribute to a better future for children and for our children. Various tools such as the Lanzarote Committee, in which our Assembly participates, or non-governmental organisations, are key to ensuring that every case of abuse is a subject of a fully documented inventory. This is necessary to achieve recognition of the suffering endured, compensation, an official apology, and punishment of the perpetrators of these acts of abuse without any statute of limitations. Thank you.
Thank you, Monsieur Fernandez. Now I call Ms. Heike Engelhardt for the Socialist Group.
Thank you, Mr. President, chers collègues. Sehr herzlich danken wir.
We thank Alain Friedès for this very important report. His trip has shown the form of mistreatment that exists in Europe and existed and still exists. It is the obligation of our member states to deal with violence against children in private, public, and religious institutions, and to recognize this and make it quite clear what is going on. Indeed, these individuals require the necessary financial and therapeutic help in order to recognize their pain, first of all, and help them heal. I worked in a psychiatric center in the southern part of Germany for quite some time, and I know how important it is to work together with these individuals, and we understand the importance of making it clear what the problems are through training, criminal record analysis, statements of self-commitment, what proximity and distance issues ought to be with children as well. These are preventive measures which have to be taken. Any sort of suspicion of misuse or abuse has to be brought to light, and those responsible have to be informed immediately, the guardians, in other words. Now, our Parliamentary Assembly has done a lot of work on this particular issue with a number of different strategies and recommendations, and of course the Lanzarote Convention for the protection of children from sexual exploitation and abuse. We also know that there are a number of different protection mechanisms, but it's also important to have proper prosecution. A lot has to be done on this front. As far as reparations from states and institutions, this is something that has to be taken into consideration as well. In Germany, there are a number of different reparations funds for children that suffered in the previous GDR regime. And also church institutions, religious institutions. A blind eye has been turned for years, but it's time now to look at this, though it may be tough and arduous. We have to create places of remembrance as well. In the Bundestag next week, there will be during the memorial ceremonies that take place for the victims of National Socialism. This year's presentation will be on child transport to the UK. It will present the history of over 10,000, for the most part, Jewish children that were in this kinder transport from National Socialist Germany to the UK. This was a doubtful effort to save these children because it led to families being torn apart. Children were separated from their parents and never saw them again. It's shedding light on a very dark corner of our national history, which must never be forgotten and which must never be repeated. Children are the most vulnerable individuals of our society. As politicians defending human rights, it is our obligation to serve children and to fight for their rights in the future. We would like to recommend that all put their stamp of approval on this excellent report.
Now I call Ms. Carmen Leite for the EPP group.
Gracias, presidente.
Thank you very much, President. I would like to thank Mr. Frites for this excellent report in which he describes in a detailed fashion and clear fashion what child abuse is in institutions and the need for proper and just reparations for the children, little girls and boys who have fallen victim. I am glad that we're speaking about this issue, bringing it to light. It has caused terrible harm for thousands and hundreds of thousands of children in the past, and it continues to do so. Be it psychological or sexual abuse, it is a scar permanent in nature and is even more cruel because this abuse takes place for the most part in the family environment where children are to be most protected. And then it takes place in different institutions and where children are under the control of individuals who are supposed to take care of them. In the hearings that we had in our commission, it was very difficult to listen to these stories of abuse from victims. And, of course, the terrible scars that have been left. I would also like to pay homage to those numerous children who commit suicide or died at the hands of their aggressors. Hair-raising and shameful is the silence, the culture of silence that has been developed around this particular terrible scourge. And so we must indeed protect those few individuals that have come forward. Scandalous are the numbers of individuals that have been abused in religious and in secular institutions. The Ombudsman has now taken up this particular issue. It has been analyzed very carefully now by the authorities, and even the Catholic Church and the Pope himself have asked for forgiveness. We've heard terrible stories, and the time has come to bring this all to the light, to the public, to understand what the serious consequences are. It's not, of course, religious institutions. It's also different institutions where children are involved, sports institutions, schools, hospitals, and so forth. And in the Balearic Islands and on the Canary Islands, although there is a supposedly progressive government in power there, there have been numerous cases of cover-up, initial cover-up, and unfortunately silencing of the allegations of minors. So the moment has come for early detection and minimize the damage. It is absolutely imperative to understand the role that society plays. Everybody, families, physicians, social services, teachers, law enforcement, and judges have to be aware of the problem. The time is to defend these victims, to ask for forgiveness, to provide reparations, to provide professional help as well, free of charge, and in cases where it is still possible for the courts to be activated, for prosecution to take place. It's now for decisions to be made because these individuals have suffered terribly and in silence. Very important, this particular report. I'd like to thank Mr. Friede for having brought all of this forward, for having underlined and emphasized the importance of our protecting children and the absolute need to protect these ever so vulnerable individuals in our society. Thank you very much.
Okay. And this concludes the political groups' talks. So now in this debate, I call next Mr. Gergely Arato from Hungary.
Mr. Chair, dear colleagues, I would like to thank the rapporteur for drawing our attention to this important problem. Child abuse in institutions is shame, the scale and seriousness of which our society may still not have realized. Shame. Shame on perpetrators. Shame on those who tolerated it. Shame on those who covered it up, who knew about it and were silent. In all countries where the phenomenon of child abuse was confronted, consequently and publicly, with protecting the victims, it was not only revealed that there are many more affected victims and the phenomenon is much more widespread, than previously thought, but also that the institutions often covered up and hid such cases. They didn't provide real redress to the victims, and worst of all, they did not do enough to prevent further cases. A heavy shield of science protected the perpetrators and made the victims even more vulnerable. It is therefore a shame for those who still do not want to reveal the causes and background of institutional child abuse, but instead protect the honor of the uniform and authority of the institutions, whether they are religious or secular ones. Shame on those for whom it is still the victims who feel guilty and not the perpetrators and their accomplices. We all have to deal with our conscience too. Did we ask enough and loud enough? Did we speak up when needed? Can we listen to every sign, every victim? Were we bold enough to demand changes? What should we do differently, stronger, louder? I am sure we all agree that today's excellent report is still only the beginning of a necessary process. We must face the past, offer relief to all victims, and track down the perpetrators and their accomplices. But that's not enough. We must prevent the re-establishment of institutional environment where children's rights are trampled upon. New institutions, new solutions, new guarantees and stronger protections are needed, both at national and international level. And most importantly, we must dispel the darkness of science with the light of honesty and dialogue. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Arato. And now I call Mr. Georgios Stamatis.
Thank you, Mr. President. Θα ήθελα να δώσω συγχαρητήρια.
I would like to congratulate Mr. Frides because his report shows that which for many years in many countries in Europe was hidden. It was hidden with the tacit approval of governments as well. After the war, we had the social state, which was created. Many children were institutionalized without providing any support to these children. Why didn't we support these children? We didn't support them because as countries, we decided to hand over protection of children to the church or to individuals that had no experience in caring for children. I'm glad that this report is at the center now, or focuses on children's rights and the protection of children. And I'm glad that all of these issues are being discussed openly. The next step ought to be the participation of children in all of this, because we have not yet heard the voice of those children in institutions, institutionalized children. When did we hear their voices? We heard their voices when they were abused, when they were poorly treated, and these children were then released into society without any prospects for the future. Those who have committed these crimes of abuse of children have to pay for their crimes. They have to be prosecuted. And the victims have to be treated in a special fashion in society. They have to be protected. They have to be cared for by society. And that's why it's ever so important for a dialogue to be developed, for us to talk about the issue of institutionalization, what's going on in institutions as well, secular and non-secular, because after decades, in my country right now, in Greece, we don't have institutions, proper institutions for children. It's necessary to use national funds to put together special programs to provide for children that need the help of the state to protect them against sexual harassment. A couple of years ago, when we legislated on sexual harassment of children and sexual abuse and what sort of support ought to be provided by the state, it was said that there has to be some sort of party responsible, some sort of agency responsible to which children or their families could refer. And once again, I feel that now it's time for children to participate in this process. But colleagues, let's not forget one thing. How are we going to support families? And how are we going to fight inequality, the numerous inequalities that lead to children, vulnerable children, either because of war or because they're refugees, that lead them to these institutions? This alone is a form of abuse. The causes of these children ending up in institutions, in other words. Thank you.
Call Mr. Rostislav Tistik from Ukraine.
Merci, Mr. President. Dear colleagues, I express my gratitude to the reporter for addressing the vital issue of child abuse in institutions in Europe, which is vital for every society. In Europe, we must never again turn a blind eye to the abuse of children, whether they have been victims of gratuitous violence, ill treatment, or sexual predators in public, private, or religious institutions that are supposed to be safe haven. Too many children's futures have been shattered beyond repair. Especially, the topic of child abuse is relevant as a result of Russia's aggression. We can only guess what inhuman methods the occupiers use for Ukrainian children in the temporarily occupied territories. Let me remind you, according to official data, Russia illegally deported near than 20,000 Ukrainian children. Unfortunately, in many countries of Europe and the world, there are isolated cases of violence. The accounts of these crimes are always harrowing, whether they took place organized in Ireland and Romania, schools in Sweden and Norway, church-run institutions in Germany, Belgium, Spain, France, and Switzerland, as well as farms in Switzerland or France or in summer camps. According to the World Health Organization, child maltreatment involves physical, sexual, and mental abuse and/or neglect of children younger than 18 years. In Europe, around 18 million children suffer from sexual abuse, 44 million from physical abuse, and 55 million from mental abuse. The most serious cases have occurred and continue to occur within public and religious institutions. When mistreatment occurs elsewhere, the state institutions often fail to fulfill their responsibility to prevent and address such abuse. However, we all understand that this number is not a final, and probably even bigger than we can imagine, and it's terrible. In the Council of Europe, which is the source of democracy and human rights, we need to take stock of the situation of child abuse in institutions in our countries. In-depth investigation must be carried out into the various institutions that may be involved today and of the past. I want to emphasize the need to turn all children illegally deported and kept by Russia to home to Ukraine. We have to influence. The victims must be granted compensations, regardless of their age. There must be official redress for all victims, for all children who have been subjected to any form of violence. And of course, to prevent this in the future, state must embark on comprehensive program of prevention and awareness-raising measures, including monitoring institutional care facilities and any situation in which children are taken into care, in order to minimize risks and detect problems at the earlier possibility stage. Thank you for attention.
Thank you, Mr. Testik. Now I call Mr. Hubert Buchel from Liechtenstein.
Thank you, Chair. Dear colleagues, at the outset, I would like to express my gratitude to Mr. Frides for compiling this report. Reports such as this play a crucial role in bringing visibility to child abuse within institutions. The statistic presented by the World Health Organization regarding individuals who have experienced sexual, physical, or psychological abuse during childhood are staggering. These acts often have lasting consequences, significantly impacting the quality of life for those affected socially, psychologically, economically. Individuals who have experienced violence during their childhood are frequently confronted with exclusion, stigmatization, and poor living conditions. All of this is unacceptable. For far too long, there has been a collective turning of blind eye in prevention, in law enforcement, and in addressing the aftermath. The taboo surrounding child abuse must be definitely eradicated at all levels. The appalling history of child abuse in institutions in Europe must be thoroughly investigated, and there should be no more turning a blind eye. Perpetrators must be held accountable. In this context, I would like to draw particular attention to the criminal prosecution with the statute of limitations mentioned in the draft decisions. Turning our attention to the present, it is crucial that individuals who were abusing during their childhood within institution feel safe to speak about their past, regardless of how many years have been passed since the incident. The suffering must be acknowledged. Responsibility must be assumed, and restitution, to the extent possible, must be made. We must create an environment that can best mitigate the consequences and ensure that each individual receives the support they need. Looking towards the future, preventing measures and awareness-building initiatives are imperative to ensure that child abuse within institutions is no longer possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bushen. Now I call Aysu Bankoğlu from Turkey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, dear colleagues. I want to express my gratitude to Mr. Frides and the colleagues who contributed to the report addressing the need for comprehensive measures to recognize, address, and prevent child abuse. As our founder, Atatürk, stated, children are the assurance of our future and our joy in life. Therefore, I believe the destructive consequences of the abuse of children are not only the victims, but also on the whole of humankind. The report highlights some striking examples in which institutions, including religious establishments and state facilities, take part in the maltreatment of children instead of combating it. The consequences of these institutional abuses are specifically destructive, as these cases are mostly neglected and persistent. This report therefore calls upon member states to recover the shame of historically rooted child abuse and seek compensation for the past and present victims. Although I contend that the proposed reparation-seeking mechanism is a significant way of highlighting the importance of the issue, I think the damage in the lives of many victims has been shattered beyond any repair, and we all need to focus more preventive measures. Thus, I would like to underpin 2 points. Firstly, the role of leadership, authority, and environmental factors in institutional abuses shall be well analyzed. Traditional institutions where child abuse occurs might be tolerated by populist or strict conservative governments. Thus, the responsibilities and the role of the governments, political institutions, and religious establishments should be scrutinized. Secondly, as the report stated, institutional abuses are especially underreported due to the various threats. In this manner, mandatory reporting systems can contribute to creating the right conditions for victims to speak out. Granting the reporters anonymity, immunity, and free legal assistance would evaluate the voices of child victims of abuse. We are all responsible for providing a well-being future for the children. I hope our studies will contribute to the protection of children by raising measures and awareness in the society. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Bankoğlu. Now I call Mr. Yuri Kamelchuk from Ukraine.
Thank you, dear Chairman, dear colleagues. I would like to address a deeply troubling issue that demands our immediate attention: child abuse in institutions across Europe. We find ourselves confronted with a disturbing reality where vulnerable children, often placed in the care of institutions, face unimaginable suffering and abuse. This is a grave violation of their basic human rights, and it's our responsibility as a member of Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe to address this issue head-on. The report presented to us today, titled Child Abuse in Institutions in Europe, is a stark reminder of the extent of the problem. It sheds light on the shocking instance of physical, emotional, and sexual abuse that have occurred within institutional settings where children should be safe, nurtured, and protected. It is disheartening to read about the pain and suffering endured by these children, many of whom have already experienced trauma and adversity in their lives. We must recognize that child abuse in institutions is not confined to a single country or region. It is a pervasive problem that transcends borders and affects children across Europe. This report serves as a wake-up call, urging us to take collective action to protect the rights and well-being of all children under our jurisdiction. To address this issue effectively, we must take the following steps: immediate investigation. We must call for thorough and impartial investigation into all allegations of child abuse in institutions. Accountability is essential, and those responsible for such heinous acts must be brought to justice. Preventive measures. We must work together to establish robust mechanisms for preventing child abuse in institutions. This includes stricter oversight, improved staff training, and the implementation of clear guidelines for the treatment and care of children in these settings. Support for victims. We must prioritize the support and rehabilitation of victims of child abuse. These children require specialized care and heal from their traumas and rebuild their lives. Legislative reforms. We should review and strengthen existing legislation to ensure that it provides adequate protection for children in institutional care. This may include enhancing reporting mechanisms and whistleblower protection. International cooperation. Child abuse is a global issue, and we must collaborate with international organizations and neighboring countries to share best practices and strategies for combating this problem effectively. And public awareness. Raising public awareness about child abuse in institutions is crucial. We must encourage open discussions and empower individuals to report any suspicious activities or concerns regarding child welfare. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kamelchuk. Now I call Ms. Pelin Yıllık from Turkey.
Gracias, Signor Presidente. Dear colleagues, I congratulate the rapporteur for his report on the distressing matter of child abuse within European institutions. The draft resolution rightly calls for immediate action to rectify the reprehensible acts perpetrated against vulnerable children in settings intended for their safety. Children in orphanages, schools, and religious establishments have faced sexual predators, violence, and maltreatment. Drawing inspiration from Switzerland's commendable practices, this resolution rightly calls upon representatives of our nations to join forces in safeguarding these young lives. As parliamentarians, we must acknowledge the heart-wrenching reality that institutions entrusted with children's welfare have become breeding grounds for the violation of their fundamental rights. This resolution underscores the gravity of the situation, urging us to address offenses with utmost seriousness and dismantle the veil of impunity shielding perpetrators. The Council of Europe, dedicated to championing human rights, has consistently led efforts to protect children. Aligned with this commitment, the resolution supports the Council's dedication to the fourth strategy for the rights of the child, underscoring the urgency to terminate all forms of violence against children is important. As representatives of our nations, we are obligated to conduct meticulous assessments of violence prevalence, recognize endured suffering, issue official apologies, and prosecute perpetrators without temporal limitations. In doing so, we reaffirm our commitment to justice, accountability, and the protection of children's rights. Furthermore, let us extend our influence internationally. The encouragement for the European Union and Morocco to accede to the Convention on the Protection of Children Against Sexual expoliation, and sexual abuse emphasizes our commitment to fortifying children's rights on a global scale. In conclusion, let us carry out parliamentary duties with unwavering resolve. The draft resolution delineates a strategic framework urging member states to adopt substantive measures towards holistic reparation, acknowledgement, and preventive strategies. I invite each of you to support this paramount case, ensuring our actions reflect the fundamental principles of human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Ms. Gillick. Now I call Mr. Stefan Schenna from Austria.
Danke sehr, Herr Präsident.
Thank you very much, President. I, too, would like to congratulate and thank the rapporteur for this contribution and for this text. Throughout my career, I've worked in a number of different institutions and, of course, have had to do with these types of issues. Children in state institutions have not only been abused, they have been used as well as workforce, if you like. They've been as labor, free labor. Also, the church as well has been the source of abuse of children. So it's now necessary to have commissions put together to provide for the reparations for these children. For example, we have such a reparations fund in Austria right now for victims of abuse in the church, but also the state. And there are a number of different mechanisms in place right now. One of those is particularly difficult. In other words, one thing very difficult indeed, those individuals who have experienced these particular terrible events, that suddenly in their old age, they have to talk about these things in order to bring closure to these particular issues. It's very difficult psychologically, but it's also recommended to have this type of experience. It also may involve the church and leaving the church. It's time now for the Catholic Church, but there's also the Protestant, the Evangelical Church as well. It's now for them time to name those individuals who have been involved in these particular activities, who have been abusing children. Of course, the Pope has gone around this particular issues. He's discussed this issue in numerous different places in Canada and elsewhere as well. But the truth is that the Church continues to protect individuals who have committed these types of crimes, who have sexually abused children, in other words. With this report, Mr. Friede has brought to the forefront something that we're familiar with. Austria is also mentioned in the report because our history is everything but rosy on this particular point. Children that were working in a dormitory, a church dormitory, have told us, we've had reports and allegations of the inhuman abuse that these individuals fell victim to, and there were also threats as well, that individuals that came forward with these particular issues were threatened with being deprived of the right to work. Much has changed, and things have become much better, and things have improved as well. There have been a number of different places as well where women could go who could undergo some form of, if you like, coming to terms with this particular problem, women who fell victim to these particular forms of abuse. But indeed, I'd like to emphasize that this is extremely important, and we, of course, endorse this report.
Ms. Larisa Bilozir from Ukraine.
Thank you, Mr. President. Dear colleagues, I would like to thank Mr. Pierre-Alain Friede for his permanent and persistent work for the protection of the most vulnerable children and refugees. This is another one important, highly valuable of your reports that present a sensible strategy to eliminate the suffering of children and emphasize the crucial need for reparations in cases of violence against them, serving historical justice and so guaranteeing human rights protection today. Violence against children can have profound and lasting consequences, affecting their physical, emotional, and psychological well-being. It is imperative for me to highlight gross violations of children's rights as a result of Russian aggression against Ukraine. Ukrainian children study the war not from the books for history, but from their own lives. Russia brutally destroyed the childhood of all 7 million Ukrainian children who were traumatized by the war from one extent to another. During the first months of the war, half of the Ukrainian children have to leave their homes. Russia violates the fundamental rights of Ukrainian children on a daily basis: the right to life, safety, education, family upbringing, a safe environment, and medical care. Children are dying in their beds while sleeping, in maternity hospitals, on playgrounds, in cars during evacuation, in hospitals from injuries. Children are killed in Kiev, in Vinnytsia, in Kharkiv. The rockets in my homeland, they don't have, place, but they haven't been. There's no safe place in Ukraine because Russian missiles know no borders. I want to tell you the story. The youngest victim was 2 days boy from Zaporizhia region that was killed in maternity hospital. And I want to tell you the story of a small girl, 4 years old, Lisa, with Down syndrome. And she was going with her mother in my hometown, Vinnytsia, to kindergarten. This rocket attack killed 23 people. 3 of them were children. 4 years old Lisa and 2 boys, 6 and 7 years. And she was killed in the stroller, this Lisa, and mother saw how her body was torn apart. She got to the hospital and she had severe injuries, and she didn't even come to her daughter's funeral. And by killing and abducting Ukrainian children, Putin wants to deprive us from our future. Russia's policy towards Ukrainian children is part of the genocide of our nation and violates and brutally neglects all international humanitarian law. So I urge you and thank you for your support to stand with Ukrainian children and people to further keep the Ukrainian dimension and Ukrainian children human rights protection on Assembly's and yours Parliament, National Parliament agenda. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Pelosi. Now I call next Lord Leslie Griffiths from United Kingdom.
President and colleagues, the sad story of the abuse of children in contexts where they should have felt safe has been well chronicled by our friend Mr. Frides. And this report makes sad reading. It's been well addressed by previous speakers, especially Ms. Bilozir, who preceded me, and others from Ukraine. Sad reading indeed. It urges us to deal with issues he raises in a constructive and compassionate way. We're in his debt. And yet, for all the urgency which he points to, I feel there's a huge gap in the story he tells. I'm referring, of course, to the arrival of the internet and social media. I've played a small part in putting legislation on the British Statute Book that aims at protecting children from online abuse. With giants in the field who've worked in these matters for a long time, and with support from every part of Parliament, we've introduced a groundbreaking piece of data protection legislation called the Age Appropriate Design Code, which requires online services to offer heightened privacy to under 18s to reflect the need of their age and stage of development, taking into account their rights under the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. This has prompted the redesign of digital products and services and introduced concepts and definitions that have become the benchmark for child-focused digital legislation in the European Union, in the United States, and beyond. I've met families whose children committed suicide through their use of social media. I've worked with the Mental Health Foundation of the United Kingdom to ensure that all providers, all platforms, large and small, take due regard for material which leads to eating disorders, self-abuse, suicide. There have been some tragic cases, but children are now far better protected by the laws we've passed. Platforms are now under close scrutiny by our regulator and will be heavily fined if they fail to carry out their monitoring duties. I hope colleagues will allow me to feel just a little bit of personal pride at the small part I've played in achieving these developments. The places focused on by Monsieur Frides are churches, state orphanages, care homes and other institutions, places where children should have been safe. It's a sad comment on the times we're living in that abuse can happen so easily in a child's own home, in a child's own room, reached by the malign tentacles of the internet, which bring pornography and so many other kinds of wickedness into the minds of young people in their moments of greatest vulnerability. We must act.
Thank you. Thank you, Lord Griffiths. Now I call Madame Mireille Clapot from France.
Monsieur le President, Rapporteur, colleagues, my second name is Yvonne. That's my grandmother was placed in an institution and was maltreated, and I dedicate this to her. I'd welcome your draft resolution. We need to make the rights and best interests of children an integral part of our institutions. For a very long time, children have not enjoyed specific rights and protections, but children are by their very nature vulnerable to predators and institutions that commit acts of abuse. Physical, sexual, psychological, and other forms of abuse have profound consequences for the health, mental well-being, and lives of the victims. The Council of Europe has drawn up international standards through the Lanzarote Convention on the Protection of Children Against Sexual Exploitation and Sexual Abuse, and for which our Assembly participates in the Committee of Parties. This convention obliges its state parties to criminalise all sexual offences against children and to take measures to prevent them, protect the victims, and to prosecute the perpetrators. But all too often, cases of child abuse go unpunished and are not compensated in a manner commensurate with the seriousness of the harm suffered. This resolution will allow us to take a step forward towards full compensation, recognising the suffering, punishing the perpetrators and compensating the victims, but also helping victim support structures and creating places of remembrance. Finally, allow me to say a few words about the case of France, which is the subject of a specific section in this report. First of all, I'd like to commend the work carried out by the committee that was set up looking into sexual abuse committed by the Catholic Church. I'd like to, though, to refer to the dramatic episode in our history where more than 2,000 children from the island of the Reunion were forcibly moved to France, in particular to the department of Creuse. This uprooting had terrible consequences for these children and will unfortunately never be fully redressed. Such was the upheaval in their lives. However, contrary to what the report states, I'd like to point out that France has taken action on this issue in recent years. In 2014, a National Assembly resolution recognised the state's moral responsibility. Then a fact-finding and research commission was set up by the government and issued a very detailed report on the subject in 2018, highlighting the role of the state in the failure of child welfare. This commission carried out a vital job of remembering this still very vivid trauma, and President Emmanuel Macron also acknowledged a failing on the part of the state in 2018. On the question of the Bumidom archives cited in the report, they are not under threat because they were deposited with the National Archives along with 174,000 individual files. Lastly, a place of remembrance has been inaugurated on Reunion Island, and a plaque was recently unveiled at Orly Airport. Admittedly, much remains to be done to repair all the wrongs, particularly from a financial point of view, but progress has been made, and I do hope it will continue, thanks to the excellent work of the associations and your work, and I hope this will continue to be carried out to protect our children. Thank you.
Now I call Ms. Olena Khomenko from Ukraine.
Fellow colleagues, I stand before you to address an issue of profound gravity, the plight of our children, especially those residing in Europe. The alarming instances of child abuse in institutions across Europe call for urgent collective actions. In this context, we urge our European partners to acknowledge and support our specific requests. First, we call for rehabilitation abroad of status children, those who have been subjected to the worst forms of abuse and neglect. It is a humanitarian imperative that transcends the borders. Moreover, we advocate for the fostering of information exchange among all countries regarding Ukrainian children in institutional care, developing a mechanism for cooperation between Ukraine's National Social Service and the competent authorities of foreign states is crucial in this regard. This will enable better tracking, support, and protection of those vulnerable children. In line with the Hague Convention on Parental Responsibility and Protection of Children, we implore strict adherence to its norms. Violations of this convention not only undermine legal frameworks, but also the safety and well-being of children. Furthermore, we call our partners for support in building housing for foster families and orphan children, especially for those whose homes have been destroyed. Ensuring the protection of the best interest of the child is not only a legal obligation, but a moral one. In conclusion, as we strive to protect our children and rebuild our nation, the role of international organizations, including the Council of Europe, becomes even more crucial. Protecting our children is a responsibility we all share. Ukraine is committed to this cause, and we hope for your support and cooperation. Thank you, dear colleagues.
Thank you, Ms. Khomenko. Now I call Mr. Mehmet Akalın from Turkey. The floor is yours.
First of all, I would like to thank the rapporteurs for this report and bringing this important subject for discussion. The pervasive issue of child abuse within various institutions across Europe is a matter of utmost urgency and moral significance. As representatives of the people, it is our collective responsibility to ensure the well-being and safety of the most vulnerable members of our society, our children. As laid out in the report, child abuse is a deeply troubling reality that extends its roots into institutions that are meant to nurture and protect our young ones. Victims have been known to suffer from physical injuries, emotional trauma, low self-esteem, mental health issues, and difficulties forming trusting relationships in the future. Many survivors also struggle with feelings of shame, guilt, and sense of betrayal. It is an issue that knows no borders, affecting children across Europe and the world in various settings such as schools, childcare facilities, religious institutions, and more recently, war zones. There have been many examples illustrating the diverse settings in which child abuse can occur. Of course, the vast majority of institutions and organizations are working tirelessly to create safe environments for the children. It is important to recognize that child abuse is not confined to a particular region or nation. The current case unfolding in America of the late financier, Jeffrey Epstein, provides fresh details about a series of abuse that grew over 3 decades and damaged dozens of teenage girls, being one example. Child abuse is a transnational challenge that requires a collaborative response, especially for child migrants who are particularly vulnerable and easily accessible to traffickers and abusers. To address this issue effectively, there should be a three-pronged approach. First, standardized reporting mechanism, harmonized legal frameworks, and finally, preventive measures and education. In conclusion, protecting the future of our children lies in our ability to confront the uncomfortable truths and take decisive actions. Together, let us send a powerful message that the safety and well-being of our children are non-negotiable priorities. It is time to stand as one with a shared determination to eradicate child abuse from our institutions and pave the way for a future where every child can grow and thrive in the environment of safety and care. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I call Ms. Olena Moshenets from Ukraine.
Thank you. Dear colleagues, we express sincere gratitude to Mr. Frides for addressing a critically important and relevant topic. It is imperative to emphasize the necessity for coordinated measures to protect children's rights in public, private, and religious institutions that are supposed to be safe havens. We appreciate the adoption of the resolution situation of the children of Ukraine yesterday, and thank you, dear colleagues, for unwavering support in regard to the return of deported children. Further exploration of the topic is the cruel treatment of Ukrainian children in the Russian Federation is essential. The deportation of even a single Ukrainian child is genocide. The Russian Federation has created conditions in the temporarily occupied territories that are entirely unsuitable for the children. This is done with the purpose of later deportation them from Ukraine. One of the gravest crimes committed by the Russians is genocide of the Ukrainian people through Ukrainian children. The children's citizenship is changed and they are handed over for illegal adoption under the care and custody of Russian Federation citizens. The Russia initially deports Ukrainian children, then grants them its citizenship and includes their data in the single federal database of children deprived of parental care. This allows them to transfer such children to Russian families for care and adoption. Currently, it is known that according to Russian data, 380 children were transferred to Russian families under so-called guardianship. Russian authorities compel Ukrainian children to assimilate into the Russian language, culture, and history, fostering an allegiance to Putin and gratitude for their supposed salvation. In camps, children are coerced to sing the national anthem of the Russian Federation, and if they refuse to do so, they are locked in a room. There is no tolerance for pro-Ukrainian stance of our children or their desire to return home. They are systematically oppressed. Instances are known where children during their stay in Russian filtration camps were separated from their parents and placed with Russian families, and the Ukrainian boy Ilya, who was admitted to a Russian hospital, underwent surgery without anesthesia. To grant these children adequate conditions, we are to repatriate them to Ukraine. For that, it is crucial to engage international mechanisms, particularly by adopting a resolution at the level of international organization. Thus, one of the most critical obligations of the Russian Federation should be facilitate the identification of deported Ukrainian children. Cruelty and violence have no place in this world. Russia must cease its aggression and return all captured Ukrainians, including deported children, to Ukraine. This can only be achieved through a collective effort, the concerted endeavors of democratic and free world nations. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I call Ms. Beatrice Timgren from Sweden.
Thank you, Mr. President. It is very important that we, as the main guardian of human rights in Europe, stand strong against all violence against children. Our children are not only our future, they are our hope for a strong and free society. Every child deserves a safe childhood. It is our work to make that sure that it's not happen. This is important for fairness and for our future together in Europe. Protecting our children is at the heart of our work. One of the biggest problems we face is sexual violence against children. It's indeed sad that many children in Europe suffer this kind of abuse, often in places where they should be safe. We see adults, for reason of cruelty or ignorance, hurting children or even abusing of them. Such terrible acts are crime against children and against our society fundamental values. We need to take strong steps to stop any such event. Sexual violence against children is always wrong. We must take our law strong enough to stop punish people to commit such awful deeds. We need a tough punishment for those who harm children in this way. We have to apply this law as widely and strictly as possible. Child marriage are another violence wrong against children's rights and freedom. We must stop this completely. There are no valid reason to allow child marriages. They are abuse and cruel. Children should be allowed to be children. We remember the important step of Council of Europe in the Parliamentary Assembly have already taken to protect children's rights. We started out by establishing the standard rules, but our work is far from finished. We must work together to make protection even more effective and make sure our children never have to face fear and pain from grown-ups. As guardians of children's rights in Europe, we have a major responsibility. We must speak up for those who often cannot speak for themselves. We must work to build a safe and brighter future for our children. We must stand together in this fight and show that we will not permit any violence or abuse against our children to go unpunished. Thank you, Mr. President, for letting me address this vital issue. Let's build a world where all children can grow up safe and free. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, with this concludes the list of speakers. Now, I call Mr. Frides, our rapporteur, to reply. You have 3 minutes, sir.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, President. I really would like to thank you most warmly for all of your contributions to this debate. They really demonstrate that you've understood and that you share the values of this report. A couple of brief remarks, if I may. To Mrs. Bankoglu from Turkey, first of all, I would like to thank you very much for your contribution. Yes, in my country, Switzerland, financial compensation has been an important part of reparation, if you like, but you can't repair everything. You're absolutely right, madam, and the ideal way forward is prevention, therefore. And that's part of the programme. It's an important part of the programme. And here I agree also with Mr. Griffiths. It's true that we don't mention this in the report, but these new technologies, the internet, they can really wreak havoc. And it is a new way for predators to access those they want to target. So it should form part of the scope of action. And I'm asking you all to please bear that in mind. Thank you for that comment. As for France, Mrs. Kleppo, I understand here and there, we've been quite critical, but it's true. In my report, I mention measures that have been adopted. Now, what's perhaps missing is that over and beyond the response of the state or the National Assembly, what they've said, what the President has said, over and beyond that, there is the question of compensation and reparation at an individual level for the people concerned. There we need to dig deeper. And perhaps I could ask you to be so kind as to convey that, to pick up the baton and take it forward for the children in the Creuse department, for instance, to help them out of this terrible, terrible situation. And then I have a comment which I address to all of you, dear members. We're speaking here of extremely serious situation. You all feel affected, impacted by it. Leaving this chamber, I hope that you will all leave with a spirit of a mission to pass this message on, pass it on to your parliaments, for things to happen, to move to action, from words to action, to look at the past, look at what's happened in the past, but, you know, to be very lucid about it and make sure that going forward the victims receive compensation and, most importantly, that these practices are relegated to history, that they do not happen again. Now, I very much hope that the resolution, the text, will be adopted. I hope by a majority, if not even unanimity, I hope so. And if it is a successful report, then I would like to pay tribute to the people up in the gallery from the Justice Initiative, who are actually at the very beginning of this whole process, who helped initiate the process and whose lives have been completely upset by the events that we have been speaking about in this chamber. So thank you very much. Thank you for being here. We applaud you. Thank you for your support. We applaud you.
Thank you. Does the chairperson of the committee, Mr. Motkin, wish to speak?
Merci, Monsieur le...
Thank you very much. Thank you, President. Well, first of all, I would like to reiterate my words of thanks to Mr. Friede, not just as a Swiss national, but also for all the work that he's done, the truth that he has brought to our committee. Thank you for organising this hearing as well. As part of that work, it was truly, truly remarkable. You've said it, Mr. Friede. Children are the victims of ill treatment, violence, brutality in public institutions, private institutions, sometimes religious institutions, who are meant to protect them. And that is, I think, what's so important about this report. These places are supposed to be safe places, places of protection for these children. But unfortunately, they've become places of nightmare, of destruction. And that is, I think, the most striking element in this whole debate today. Now, what's the solution? The solution is the truth. Put an end to the omerta. We must speak truth to power. And thank you to the rapporteur for raising all of this. Allow me to also flag a couple of points from the report that I think are important and worth repeating. Consequences, psychological consequences for the individuals, for the victims, that's one thing, but also social consequences, professional consequences. These individuals have been exposed to violence, to horrific events. That has a knock-on effect. It has a knock-on effect for their place in society. It is very difficult for them, so we need to provide social support and psychological support to the individuals concerned. Obviously, these revelations are important. We have this report. I very much hope that the report will be adopted, of course, today by the House. That's one thing. But then, as politicians, as member states, we need to also create spaces for more revelations to be brought to light. And then another point, colleagues. Mr. Friede has said quite rightly, we need to tidy up our own house. I'm Belgian, and I have tried to tidy up my own house. Belgium ultimately captured or brought back, shall I say, 20,000 children from Congo, from the period of colonization. The children who'd been literally torn away from their mothers, we've managed to bring them back. And also in Belgium, we have a committee now on sexual abuse, particularly within the church. We know that there are maybe 1,000 cases that have been detected so far, and that might just be the tip of the iceberg. So we will also make progress on that front with that work. Thank you to the Legal Affairs Committee. Thank you very much, Mr. Eftathiou, for your opinion, your report on this same topic. Freedom of speech, yes, so important. Speech must be free. And also thank you to our Ukrainian colleague who spoke about the 20,000 children deported from Ukraine. Thank you for reminding us of that. Also 17 migrant children per day since 2018 who have been basically disappearing off our radars. They've just disappeared. We don't know where these children are, and it's happening daily. It's also part of our work here in the Assembly. Ill treatment is something that happened in the past, unfortunately is still happening today, and it's affecting our children. And I too would like to pay tribute to our audience up there. Thank you for attending this debate.
The debate is closed now. The Committee on Social Affairs, Health and Sustainable Development has presented a draft resolution and a draft recommendation. It's the document 15889, to which no amendments have been tabled. We will therefore proceed to the vote on the draft resolution contained in document 1588-9. A simple majority is required. The vote is now open. It's okay. Yes, the vote is closed now. I call for the result to be displayed. Yes, the draft resolution in document 1588-9 is adopted. We will now proceed to vote on the draft recommendation contained in document 15889. A two-thirds majority is required. Now the vote is open. The vote is closed. I call for the result to be displayed. The draft recommendation in document 15889 is adopted. Yeah, she's going to come.
The next item of business this morning is the debate on the report titled The Progress of the Assembly's Monitoring Procedure, January-December 2023, document 15893, presented by Mr. Piero Fassino on behalf of the Monitoring Committee. In order to finish by 12:55 p.m., I will interrupt the list of speakers at about 12:45 to allow time for the reply and vote on the draft resolution. I call Mr. Fassina, the rapporteur. You have 7 minutes now and 3 minutes at the end of the debate to reply.
Merci, Madame.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Thank you very much. I shall be speaking Italian. As you know, the Monitoring Committee has two tasks. First of all, ensuring a proper monitoring of the implementation of the obligations that are to be met by every country that has signed the Charter of the Council of Europe. And furthermore, it also has to periodically review these matters together with member states.
Also, looking at a whole series of affairs now, Albania, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Bosnia, Georgia, Moldova, Serbia, Turkey, and others, all these countries where that have been taken up over these last couple of years because of problems related to rule of law and the respecting of fundamental liberties and human rights. So, also in Bulgaria, Montenegro, and Northern Macedonia, the post process was in place. And over the last years, San Marino and France have been under a similar such post procedure. So, I simply wanted to remind you about the particular issues that have been taken up in all of these countries which are under monitoring right now. Independence of the judiciary is particularly at risk. Freedom of information, something which is frequently in question. The issue of corruption, particularly government responsibility as concerns corruption, and also the judiciary involvement as well, and parliamentarians. So all of these countries that are in the post-monitoring process have their issues of minorities as well, the respect of the rights of women, and in particular, the implementation of rules and regulations which go hand in hand and which flow, of course, from the Istanbul Convention, the respect of citizens as concerns their sexual orientation. In many countries, there is no proper recognition of these rights, and, of course, issues which are more political, for example, electoral laws, frequently electoral laws which don't offer for proper broad representation of all political forces. The non-implementation of rulings of the European Court of Human Rights, for example, the Kavala case, which we've dealt with on numerous different occasions. That's not the only instance. There are numerous different countries under post-monitoring right now where there are serious difficulties as far as the implementation, as far as the execution of rulings of the court. And political polarization as well in many countries, particularly in the eastern part of the continent, serious issues of polarization. And of course, this has terrible reverberations as well. It creates problems as far as the legitimization of systems. Systems are in decomposition. Rule of law is falling apart because of this polarization. And then issues of monitoring, other ones which have been taken up as well. Of course, we're in close cooperation with the Venice Commission, a very essential cooperation because they provide legal substance, if you like, to what we do, working together with Greco as well, that deals with the fight against corruption. As concerns periodic countries that are under periodic scrutiny, San Marino and France, rule of law is well entrenched. Nonetheless, there are issues that have to be taken up. For example, the executive forces, the executive powers, and the excessive executive powers in certain instances, the condition in prisons, the election of judges. These are also issues that are taken up as well. Even in countries where there are long and well-entrenched democracies. So this particular report, the final draft report, of course our rapporteurs have, with numerous visits in the various countries under investigation, under monitoring, and they've met with parliaments, governments, with civil society, with NGOs, and at the end, prior to submitting their reports to the Commission, have discussed with a number of different individuals within the committee as well to take into consideration and to analyze effectively and profoundly all of the observations. So a very, very well manicured and well drafted reports in general. Now, the monitoring committee and the subcommittee for the resolution of conflicts between member states. For example, we have Armenia and Azerbaijan. We've been working on that considerably, but the experience in this subcommittee has, of the chair, Mr. Kern, he's called for a development of this particular subcommission for it to evolve into a commission or a committee which would deal with these particular issues of conflict in a preventive fashion, hopefully, before there's a dramatic escalation. Now, as far as the ministerial summit in Reykjavik, of course, a number of different issues were brought to the forefront. For example, reinforcing the activities of the Council of Europe in the fight against centralization is one of the issues that we've dealt with, of course, in working on civil society, on rule of law, and fundamental human rights. In Reykjavik, a number of important messages, of course, taken up by the committee, the monitoring committee as well, and embraced indeed and further developed in the Rome seminar, where we looked at the results of the Iceland summit, of the Reykjavik summit, and finding ways in order to implement all of those recommendations that were issued then. So with this particular report, all of these various recommendations have been closely detailed, country by country. I'd like to thank you for your attention at this point and invite you to make any comments that you'd like. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Fassino. And in the debate, I call first Mr. Julian Bulay, that will represent ALDE Group. Mr. Bulay, you have the floor.
Ringrazio la Presidenta, non ho saputo che sarò il primo.
Thank you very much. I didn't know I was going to be the first to speak. I'd like to thank you. I'd like to thank you for the excellent work that you've done, very important for us, and you've always been extremely impartial in your views, and you've always invited members of other members to participate in all decision-making processes. So thank you very much. And indeed, the Rome seminar was extremely useful. I'd like to thank you for this report. I'd like to thank you for the way that you presented this recent report about the situation in Israel as well. I know that there was great pressure exerted in this particular instance, but I do feel that this particular report really did take on board all of the various parties and views and opinions, and this report the same.
This institution, I said it, I will repeat it, it's not a club of perfect countries. It is a gathering of countries accepting to do better. And here we have the tools to do it better. And the monitoring committee is the tool of the Parliamentary Assembly that is giving the exact indications on how a country can do better in terms of observing rule of law, protecting human rights, and strengthening democracy. I am very sad that the electoral law in Hungary has been changed within 6 months before the elections, as that has been criticized in many, many cases by the Venice Commission. It is very sad that this took place. And I really call upon the Hungarian government and authorities, Mr. Orban, to take all the feedbacks and to respect all these observations and opinions from the Venice Commission in order not to go in the wrong direction. We see where other countries go. That's not the way to do it. I want to congratulate Ukraine for amending the bill on national minorities. That was really important, and this is a great example of a country complying with the recommendations of the Venice Commission. I also want to congratulate the Republic of Moldova for continuing its commitments on the path of democracy and for always investing in decisions that are to build a better future for this country. And I'm very happy that our colleague has been appointed this week, Mihai Păpușoi, chair of the Moldovan delegation, the new Minister of Foreign Affairs. That's a great recognition of his work here too. I strongly condemn, on behalf of ALDE, the fraud that took place within the Serbian election. That is serious. That type of behavior that took place in Serbia might have repercussions, negative repercussions for the whole region. I'm very happy that we in ALDE have invited already the representatives of the Serbian opposition to share with us their concerns and their thoughts. And I hope that your committee would have these types of meetings in the coming months too. Now, I want us to have good rapporteurs on both Spain, Sweden and Greece, and I wish us good luck with electing the best ones, to have great reports in order not only to point a finger at countries and play the arrogant role from a pan-European level, but stretching a hand to do better. Thank you, felicitazione, in bocca al lupo.
Thank you, Mr. Bulai. And the next speaker is Andrei Huniko, who represents European Left Group. Please, you have the floor.
Vielen Dank.
Thank you very much, Madam President. I too would like to take this opportunity to thank Mr. Fassino for this excellent work that you've done for our monitoring committee and also the excellent work you've done on this report. The debate that we're having here, debate on progress, so-called progress, it's not always progress, let's face it. This debate is a kind of general debate for our Assembly, and therefore let me preface my comments with the following words. I think that this Assembly is an Assembly that really must do more. It must do more in order to put an end to the wars currently underway. We have the appalling war in Ukraine, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. We have also war in Israel and Gaza. It seems to me of the utmost importance to deal with this. I understand it's not a core mandate of the Council of Europe, doesn't form part of it, but nevertheless we should do something about it. And therefore, thank you, Mr. Fassino, for your invitation to Rome. The president of your country, in fact, reached out to us and said, please find a solution to put an end, for instance, to this conflict, Russia, Ukraine, the war that is currently unfolding before our eyes. Now, the monitoring procedure, initially, the way it was designed was to say, well, there are those who can teach you how to do it, and then there are those who need to learn how to do it. Those who could teach it apparently were from the West, and the ones from the East were the ones who were supposed to learn. But that's changed over the last few years. We don't just have monitoring procedures, we have periodic reviews, and I think that's a very good thing. And incidentally, it's mentioned in the report. It's a good thing that we have changed things like that. We've got San Marino, France, the Netherlands, they all are under periodic review. It's a good thing, and there are some important comments made in the report regarding that. Now, another point that I would flag, if the system is to be operational, then each and every one of us needs to be conscious of the fact that all school children should receive tuition in, that we're all children, we're all learners when it comes to learning about rule of law, democracy and freedom. It is a matter of humility. Recognise that, a better way of learning subsequently. We're all here learning. Final comment, the website the website on the protection of journalists, a very important website. I don't think enough work has been done on that to date. You know, there are several dozens of journalists who are currently in prison, as they have been for some time now. I mean, it won't come as a surprise, but, you know, in Azerbaijan, for instance, or in Turkey or in Ukraine. And furthermore, we have one journalist, Julian Assange. I'd like to name him. We've spoken quite a lot about Julian Assange this week. We're talking here about, you know, one country, which is a member state of the European Union, Poland. A journalist there, Pablo González, has been in prison there for 2 years now. No charges have been brought against him. It's a Spanish journalist. He's behind bars in Poland. I find that extraordinary. Thank you very much once again, Mr. Fassino, and we will, of course, vote in favour. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hunko. And now I call Mr. Stefan Schenach to have a speech on behalf of Socialist Group.
Thank you very much, Madam President. As a previous chair of the Monitoring Committee, I too should like to pay compliments to Piero Fassino, who has done a terrific job of work over the last 2 years. And this progress report is a comprehensive overview of all the various reports that we have done. Now, since 2015, we have brought about a far-reaching change, and that is that there are some countries that are never looked at, whereas since that date we have countries who are all subject to periodic reviews, and I think that that is a vast improvement. And I think that we had one country in which we completed monitoring, Monaco, and so we brought to an end the monitoring process from Monaco many, many years ago. And the delegates from Monaco were delighted that we had made so much progress. And it's not that it was easy, rather it was extremely difficult when it came to bringing about change in Monaco. So it's something that Monaco benefited from. What is important, however, is that we have this overview of the evaluation of the reports by the Monitoring Committee. I think it is one of the most important pillars of the Council of Europe and of the Assembly as a whole. And that is why I hope that the committee, which was initially set up as a subcommittee, so that was a subcommittee on states in conflict, I very much hope that we can keep that unit. We can have specific reports on countries in conflict, and I think that's extremely important and something that we ought to preserve going forward. Now, obviously, there are all kinds of areas in which we still have work to do. I mean, you know, on some fronts there have been clear improvements, but a lot of backsliding when it comes to freedom of the media and freedom of the press and so on and so forth. And that applies to the developed, advanced democracies as well. And, you know, let me reiterate that anybody who is under monitoring has certain commitments that they must honour. For example, to invite the Council of Europe to observe elections. And I remember back in the day when Poland was under monitoring, it was obvious to the Polish government that it would issue an invitation to observe presidential elections. And there was a small but very effective team which was there to observe the runoff. And again, in doing so, the country was honouring one of its commitments. And it means that everybody in a country is represented.
Thank you, Mr. Shenach. And now I call to have a floor Mr. Sachiva, Ms. Denica Sachiva from EPP Group.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Dear colleagues, on behalf of EPP CD Group, I would like to say that we highly appreciate the report presented today by Mr. Piero Fassino and to recognize with gratitude his personal efforts as chair of the Monitoring Committee. The monitoring procedure of the Assembly has been a booster to our democratic development. We appreciate the role of the Council of Europe in consolidating democracy, rule of law, and human rights. Being Bulgarian, I would like to emphasize on the fact that for Bulgaria, the procedure of post-monitoring is lasting already for 24 years, and for all those years, we cooperated promptly and made a lot of efforts and achievements. We are grateful for the dialogue with the Assembly during this whole long period. With the formation of the current regular government in April 2023, Bulgaria overcame a 2-year political crisis, during which 5 governments succeeded each other. We recently amended the constitution following the recommendations of the Venice Commission to strengthen the judicial reform. The recommendation of the Assembly on concentration and transparency of media ownership was fulfilled with amendments made back in 2018, and I call upon the rapporteur to revisit once again the particular recommendation in item 5.1. Recommendations should be clear and reflecting current state of development if there are expectations they to be fulfilled. Amendments to criminal code have been made, introducing heavier sentences for hate crime and criminal liability for domestic violence. The law on protection against domestic violence expanded further the victim protection. The monitoring procedure is a dialogue between the Assembly and the particular member states within the European family. In this dialogue, we need to receive clear messages and our arguments have to be listened to. Only in this way the monitoring procedure could play its supportive role in our democratic development based on mutual understanding and respect. As all of you, we are now through challenging times after the beginning of the Russian war against Ukraine, which is characterized by widespreading of fake news and anti-European feelings. We don't want our quite long post-monitoring dialogue to fuel further such negative attempts. In conclusion, the PACE post-monitoring dialogue has fulfilled successfully its purpose. We look forward to continuing our cooperation with PACE through periodic reviews, just like the vast majority of member states. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Sachiva. And now I would like to give the floor to Mr. Sirontitus Minkaciu from European Conservatives and Democratic Alliance Group.
Thank you very much, Madam President. I would like to refer, as a conservative, to some very worrisome aspects of the political climate in the countries that were already under monitor. And of course, I would like to thank Mr. Fassino for the work that he has done to gather all those reports. Now, what I'm trying to refer is the position of our conservative friends and partners in different countries. They have now in the parliament, they have already standing some corridor sanitaire, non-cooperation with your fellow MPs, member of the parliament. I think that's a very worrisome phenomena, and it was not addressed at all. A second one, I would like to remind that we have passed through a pandemic situation, and in certain countries, certain parliaments, governments took upon themselves to have coercion, to disregard the human rights when it comes to experimental vaccination. So the Nuremberg codes were violated. Unfortunately, this kind of violation of human rights were not object to the rapporteurs. And tell you the truth, I found that very interesting due to the fact that we are here an organization to defend human rights. Secondly, I would like to remind that there is a climate in the media and in the communications in those parliaments on the countries that were under monitoring, that certain censorship is going to be instituted at the government level. Again, this organization is for human rights. We should not let the censorship of journalists, of ideas to send in just because we disagree with those ideas. And I think censorship should be one of the central issues in the next monitoring commission. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Next is Mr. Armen Rustamian.
Thank you very much, President. Dear colleagues, first and foremost, I would like to commend the rapporteur on his report regarding the progress of the Assembly's monitoring procedure for a rather difficult period, particularly as concerns the countries that are under the full monitoring procedure right now. With regard to that, the Assembly expresses its concern in the light of some developments which are negative and also shortcomings, and it calls upon these countries to step up their efforts in order to make sure that they fully meet their obligations as member states and meet their obligations in terms of their commitments when they signed up to become members of the Council of Europe. Most importantly, it's really essential to listen to the criticism and to take on board the relevant recommendations made. As far as my country is concerned, for instance, the Assembly is asking our authorities to strengthen freedom and independence of the media, and they're asking us to continue with our reform of the judicial system, fight against corruption, and also really establish a genuine democratic culture in the country. As concerns Azerbaijan, our neighbour country, the current state of affairs in this country really has an impact, I would say, directly on the situation prevailing in Armenia. In the report, in the parts that mention Azerbaijan, you'll see a long, very long list of serious violations when it comes to the obligations that this country should be respecting. I can but emphasise the breaches that really signify the incompatibility of that country with its status as a member state of the Council of Europe. It could, in fact, be read as a complete contempt for international law and complete disregard for international institutions, I would say. So, for instance, Azerbaijan has completely ignored the rulings of the International Court of Justice as well as the European Court of Human Rights. Azerbaijan has continuously set up obstacles preventing the rapporteurs from our organisation to go in situ to carry out their missions. This is a clear, blatant example of a lack of cooperation. There's also the forced exodus of all the Armenians from Nagorno-Karabakh following a military aggression, and that in turn was after 10 months of a blockade imposed by the authorities of Azerbaijan, and it has been recognised as an operation that had been planned in advance, and its purpose was ethnic cleansing. Also destruction, systematic destruction of monuments, our cultural heritage, our Armenian religion, kind of trying to wipe out our Christian heritage here. Also, the Assembly is following very closely the situation as concerns Armenian prisoners of war, civilians and other persons currently detained, as well as all representatives of Nagorno-Karabakh currently detained in Azerbaijan. The Assembly calls upon Azerbaijan to immediately release all of these detainees. Indeed, we are legitimately worried about these individuals who are of Armenian origin but who are currently behind bars in Azerbaijan. They hope to obtain justice in a country where we've taken due note of the fact that there are many problems prevailing in the judicial system, violations of human rights, and also shortfalling when it comes to the prevention of torture. And finally, in the light of all of these serious violations of our fundamental principles, the Assembly decided not to ratify the credentials of the Azerbaijani delegation. This is not a question of punishing. This is a question of making sure that we really preserve our common values. These sanctions are there in order to, first of all, put an end to the situation, to prevent new violations, and to rectify the situation which is not compatible, clearly not compatible, with the status of a member state of the Council of Europe. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Samian. Next is Mr. Haik Mamiyanyan.
Thank you. Honorable Mr. President, dear colleagues, what is the definition of the word crime? That is the question I want to raise here at the altar of human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. Is revealing the truth government tries to hide from its citizens a crime? That's exactly why the Vice President of the Republican Party, Armen Ashotyan, is under pretrial arrest for more than 7 months. Is expressing your political views via Facebook Live or status a crime? That is why Narek Malyan is in jail for more than 4 months. Or is winning in a local election a crime? That is why the elected mayor of Vanadzor, Mamikon Aslanyan, is in jail for more than 2 years. Or would you call a crime peacefully protesting in the center of Yerevan, demanding from government to do something to rescue their parents blockaded in Nagorno-Karabakh by Azeri armed forces? This is why at this very moment, 11 students are in courtroom. 4 of them spent months in jail and are still there. As of November of 2023, there were more than 50 political prisoners in Armenia. And these are not just words of oppositional MP. The European People's Party and the centrist Democrat International adopted resolutions regarding Armen Ashotyan and other political prisoners. Or is a fighting in a war that Azerbaijan started against us a crime? That is exactly why Armenian POWs have been kept in Baku as a hostage, as a bargaining chip since 2020 until now. Or maybe peacefully living in your homeland is a crime, because the civilian Vagiv Khachaturian was convicted of an enormous sentence by the Azerbaijani court just for that reason. Or is organizing the defense of your own people against aggression is a crime? That is exactly why Levon Mnatsakhanyan and David Manukyan are in Baku jail at the moment. Or perhaps giving a hope to your compatriots, or simply being a philanthropist is a crime. That is the reason why Aliyev's regime is holding Ruben Vartanyan accountable by arresting him. Since when serving your own country with honor and duty is such a crime, that David Babayan and David Ishkhanyan have to be kept under custody in Baku? Or is running a country that, by the reports of various international organizations, was incomparable by the level of democracy to Azerbaijan, such a crime that Presidents Arkady Ghukasyan, Bako Saakyan and Arai Karutunyan should be in prison? Well, it turns out that being a democratically elected president is a crime for Mr. Aliyev. Mentioning these facts in the reports and resolutions adopted by PASE and other international organizations give those people a tiny light of hope while they are looking at the checkered sun for a very long time. We owe it to them, at least. Thank you.
Thank you. Next is Mrs. Eka Sepasvili. Is Mrs. Saakashvili here? No. Oh, sorry.
Thank you.
Yes.
First of all, let me thank you, Mr. Fassino, for his excellent work on his report. And I would like to highly appreciate that the report once more underlines and reiterates its full support for Georgia's sovereignty and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. And this is very important for the people of Georgia. During our session in Strasbourg, we spoke much about Russia's aggression towards Ukraine, but such kind of aggression was in Georgia in 2008. And now our territories, 20% is occupied by Russian territories. And the conflicts are going on the territory of not only Europe, but on the whole planet of our
earth. So this is very important for every nation and every state. Currently, as you may know, we are implementing our reform agenda, which is dedicated our European agenda. As you may know, in last year, December, Georgia was granted candidate status, and we are very proud of such kind of developments because it's a recognition of Georgia's aspiration and work we have done during the implementation of those 12 recommendations that the European Commission issued for Georgia on the one hand, and on the other hand, it is the implementation of the association agreements that we have signed approximately 10 years ago. Georgia is fully committed to fulfill all the obligations and make harmonized our national legislation and national institutional building to the European acquis and European best practice. Of course, we are going to implement and to go on with our reforms. Now we are implementing the 9 steps European Commission issued to open the negotiations for Georgia on the membership. And I can proudly announce that in the main ranking that are issued by different organizations such as World Economic Forum, International Monetary Fund, World Bank, and so on, Georgia is on the positions, and these positions are advancing year after year. And I can name such important issues such as rule of law, control of corruption, confidence in the independence of judiciary, and so on, so on. Our economy is continue to grow, and last several years we have 11 and 10% of economic growth, and GDP of per capita is growing constantly. And of course, it is very important as well because the welfare of population should be rise gradually and eventually in order to become it more easy for Georgia to become the member of European members. But it is very pity, and unfortunately, I have to announce that opposition parties are against this process, and they are boycotting this process. For instance, during the last year, they did not participate in the reforms that we implement during parliamentary work to meet the issues, these 12 recommendations that the Commission was issued. Moreover, yesterday, one of my colleagues from
please close your speech because you are already 1 minute more.
Okay, opposition party has addressed the assembly and announced huge bulk of disinformation. And I think it is not acceptable. We all should work towards the benefit of our country.
Thank you,
and
Mrs.
not the against of
Thank you so much.
political party. Thank you.
Mrs. Olena Mosenets.
Monetary Committee for its assessment of Ukraine's progress and recommendations. So we thank the EU member states for their trust and granting Ukraine the status of a candidate for accession to the Union. Indeed, as a result of the Russian Federation's war of aggression against Ukraine, it is difficult to monitor the fulfillment of the commitments undertaken. Nevertheless, I would like to know the extraordinary progress made by Ukraine amidst these difficulties. Ukraine is confidently making great strides on the path to European integration. For us, it is not just a question of being in the Union or not. It is a question of the values that we defend in this assembly: democracy, human rights, and freedoms. Granting Ukraine the status of the EU candidate and recommending the start of accession negotiation will only be possible if Ukraine makes progress in reforms and implements the recommendations of the European Commission. As Deputy Chairman on the Committee on Anti-Corruption Policy in Ukraine, I can say that this year Ukraine has made a big step towards overcoming corruption. In particular, the approval of the State Anti-Corruption Program for 2023-2025 is a significant achievement. This will help to bring additional funds to the Ukrainian budget and strengthen transparency in the sectors most affected by corruption. Moreover, in these difficult times and risk, we are opening e-declarations for public officials to the public. Institutional strengthening remains a key area for Ukrainian politicians, as exemplified by the adoption of a law to increase the staff and strengthen the institutional capacity of the National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine. Anti-oligarchic laws are already in place. As a result, several oligarchs have given up their media assets, but some have been forced to give up their freedom and ended up in pre-trial detention centers. The Constitutional Court has also been reformed in line with the recommendations of the Venice Commission, making it more transparent and integrity. Ukraine's diverse and multinational population has faced challenges, especially on the backdrop of Russia's aggression that denies the existence of the Ukrainian identity. But despite the manipulation of the Kremlin's propaganda machine, we have protected all groups living in Ukraine. We thank the international community for recognizing these efforts and for standing in solidarity with Ukraine as it moves toward a more secure and democratic future. Effective reforms are our tool for survival in the face of constant shelling, information from the front line, and in memory of all those who have fallen for free, independent, democratic Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I must now interrupt the list of speakers. The speeches of members on the speakers list who have been present during the debate but have not been able to speak may be given to the table office for publication in the official report. I remind colleagues that typewritten texts can be submitted electronically if possible, no later than 4 hours after the list of speakers is interrupted. I now call Mr. Piero Fassino to reply to the debate. Dear Piero, you have 3 minutes.
Grazie.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Mr. Boulay quite rightly started off by saying that none of us here are perfect. He's quite right to say that. And Mr. Hunko said that this exercise, checking the state of application of the Council of Europe Convention on Human Rights, is one for all of us. You know, we're all on the school bench here, but we're not a court either. I mean, we have a judicial body, the European Court, whereas we are a Council of Europe committee which is tasked with checking the state of progress and trying to provide encouragement if rights are not respected or where countries are uncertain as how to apply them, and to give signposts and pointers to countries as to how to apply our recommendations and resolutions in a positive and constructive spirit, because, you know, we're not here to wag our fingers or to adjudicate. Rather, we are just trying to make sure that citizens' fundamental rights are respected. And all democracies, of course, need to prove their credibility day in and day out by enforcing citizens' rights, the rights of minorities, rights to information, freedom of information, democratic standards in public life in our countries. And that even extends to social rights. The kinds of social rights that are now being thrown up by contemporary society. All the kinds of rights, for example, flowing from the health emergency linked to COVID. And of course, the Council of Europe also has to look at those rights, as it did during this part session. That also applies to the kinds of rights which would arise from climate change, looking at what people's rights are in the face of contemporary challenges. So human beings have to be front and center of everything we do, so we need to be there to intervene wherever rights are not being properly upheld. Now, this work is for all countries. Some are resistant and some happily go along with our recommendations. I mean, in the case of Azerbaijan, for example, they had to undergo the suspension of their credentials because they have failed to let in our rapporteurs or heed our recommendations. And you've got the case of Turkey, for example, which has not enforced ECHR judgments, most notably in the case of Osman Kavala. So where there is a failure to respect rights, then we see, for example, repressive measures such as the detention of journalists or ordinary citizens. Let me just raise the question of Ilaria Salis, an Italian citizen who is being held in inhuman conditions in Hungary. And I would like to take this opportunity here and now to call for her case to be resolved. Ilaria Salis is being held in appalling conditions. It's absolutely vital that we speak out for those who are subject to court trials. So that's everything I have to say for now, but allow me, in closing, President, to express my gratitude in this, my final act as the chair of the Monitoring Committee, which I have chaired for the last 2 years. I should like to thank all of those who have spoken here in the chamber for their kind words, appreciation for my efforts, which are most gratifying. And I should also like to pay tribute to all the work that our committee has done, which would not be possible without our very skilled, able and dedicated secretariat and all the staff members who go to make it up. And I'd like to express my gratitude to members who have placed their trust in me, placed me at the helm of this committee, the secretariat that has helped me over the last 2 years has really been very valuable assistance in my efforts to chair the committee. This has been a significant political as well as personal experience for me, and I am delighted to be able to continue to work as a member of the Monitoring Committee, and I will do everything I can to bring all the experience that I've had over the last 2 years as chair to bear on my work as an ordinary rank-and-file member of the committee. Thank you very much.
Mr. Fassino, dear Piero, I've been following your speeches the last year since 2019, having been a member of this Honourable Assembly. I want to thank you because whenever I was listening to what you have said, I was gaining experience out of your voice. Thank you for your job. Thank you for what you have done. 2 years chairing a committee. And I want to thank you for organizing an excellent meeting with President Mattarella in Rome. Dear colleagues, the Monitoring Committee has presented a draft resolution in document 15893, to which 2 amendments and 1 sub-amendment have been tabled. Amendments will be taken in the order in which they appear in the compendium. I remind you that speeches on amendments are limited to 30 seconds. I understand that the Monitoring Committee wishes to propose to the Assembly that Amendment 2 to the draft resolution, which was rejected by the Committee with a 2/3 majority, be declared as rejected. If no one objects, I will consider the amendment to be rejected. Is there an objection? If there is, we will need to verify that the objection has the required support of 10 people, so please could those who object raise their hand. Amendment 2 to the draft resolution is therefore rejected and will not be called. I call now Mr. Givi Mikanandze to support Amendment 1. You have 30 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We understand that the Monitoring Committee had no chance to consider the progress which Georgia made after the candidate status has been granted in December 2023. Therefore, we directly have no objection just to move to the sub-amendment which has been agreed by the committee. Thank you.
Does anyone else wish to support this amendment? The Monitoring Committee has tabled a sub-amendment to the amendment. Does anyone wish to support this sub-amendment? Mr. Fassino?
Sì, il subemendamento.
Yes. Yes. We are happy with that sub-amendment, and in the report, we, of course, have acknowledged all the work that has been done by Georgia, and obviously seeking to meet its Council of Europe obligations as well as what is required by the EU. But, you know, there are still problems outstanding, and that is why we have suggested that we should delete the words, the very intensive work done by Georgia. But in the amendment as sub-amended, there's nevertheless recognition of all the efforts that are being made by Georgia to obtain certain status by the EU as well as the Council of Europe. So this in no way detracts from our appreciation of the efforts that have been made by Georgia, if I can put it that way.
Against the sub-amendment? No. What is Mr. Mikanadis' opinion on the sub-amendment?
As I have already underlined, we have no objection.
What is the opinion of the committee? Okay. Yes, sure. I shall now put the sub-amendment to the vote. The vote is open. The vote is closed. I call for the result to be displayed. The resolution is adopted. Unanimously.
The resolution, sorry, the amendment.
The amendment, sorry, yes. The resolution follows. We will now proceed to vote on the draft resolution contained in the document 15893 as amended. A simple majority is required. The vote is now open. The vote is closed. I call for the result to be displayed. The draft resolution is adopted unanimously. The next item on today's agenda is the continuation of the debate of the progress report of the Bureau and the Standing Committee. At its meeting this morning, the Bureau has proposed several references to committees. They are set out in document 15885, addendum 6. These references must be submitted for ratification by the Assembly in accordance with Rule 26.3. Are there any objections to these references? There are no objections. The references are approved. I now propose that the other decisions in the progress report, document 15885, addendum 6, be ratified. Are there any objections? No objections. The progress report is approved. The final business today is to constitute the Standing Committee. The membership of the Standing Committee is determined by Rule 17.3 as follows. The President of the Assembly, the Vice Presidents of the Assembly, the leaders of the political groups, the chairpersons of national delegations, and the chairpersons of the general committees. A full list of members is set out in Document Commission 2024-02. The Standing Committee is accordingly constituted. We have now to come to the end of our business. I would like to thank all members of the Assembly, particularly rapporteurs of committees, for their hard work during this part session. I would like to thank the Vice Presidents who chaired during the part session, Mr. Pierre-Alain Frides, Mrs. Olena Komenko, Mr. Davis Morris, Mr. Marco Nicolini, Mr. Zana Novakovic-Bursak, Mr. Gildirim Turkes, Mrs. Tamara Vonda. I would also like to thank the staff and interpreters, both permanent and temporary, who have worked hard to make the part session a success. The second part of the 2024 session will be held from 15 to 19 April 2024. Before leaving, ladies and gentlemen, I would remind you to place your voting cards in the ballot box provided for this purpose at the end of the chamber. I declare the first part of the 2024 session of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe closed. The sitting is closed.